I've been at Investec for almost 19 years now, and Investec has been a fantastic place to work over that period. Well, Brexit's the term that describes the possible departure of Great Britain from the European Union. The global economy, it's in a very tricky place right now. In terms of my career, I did economics at university at Bath and loved it. And I decided I wanted to do a master's and perhaps follow it up as a career. And I did my master's at Manchester University in econometrics, the mathematical end of things. And even that didn't put me off doing economics. So I joined the government economics service, where I worked for a couple of years before I joined Barclays as an econometrician. And going fast forward now, I've been at Investec for almost 19 years now. And Investec has been a fantastic place to work over that period. No day is the same, but a pattern might be that we start pretty early, before 7 in the morning. We work out what's gone on in markets and the news overnight, and we convey that news via meetings to various parts of the business and to the sales desks to inform their clients. The rest of the day can be forecasting, writing notes, speaking to clients, speaking to people in stakeholders in the business internally. Something I do a lot of is actually going out and talking to clients or speaking at conferences. So I'm on the road quite a lot. I can be around the UK or overseas sometimes, and I do several road shows. I think any economist will probably do that in the city. So going out to see groups of clients for a few days or even a week at a time. I'm not really sure. I mean, I think you have to have analytical ability and a certain amount of technical proficiency. But a really critical skill is you have to be able to communicate. It doesn't matter what you're saying, and if people aren't listening to you, then really that chops away a lot of your added value. So I think being able to speak succinctly, being able to write short notes and interesting notes so you entice your clients to read them as well, that really, really helps. Yeah, in terms of the evolution of the economics role, it's a really good question, because it's changed a lot since I started. How long is it now? 30 years or so. At the time, it was okay. Where do you get your information sources from when you process them? Now we've got loads of information. It's a case of how you're able to process that information, and then what you do with it, and how you communicate it. And that's perhaps something looking forward as well, that there is an increasing competition because of blogosphere, for example. More people have got things to say and are being listened to. And so I think as an economist, you have to try and press your, hopefully, an absolute advantage over the competition in getting your views over to clients. And I think that's a big challenge for the future. Well, I think over the few decades that I've been doing this job, that there have always been celebrity economists, those which get very listened to in whichever media of the media you care to look at. I think that will always be the case. But I think my own ambition is to try and get things right and try and add value to the client. And that's not always consistent with being the highest profile. So I think being listened to is great, so that profile is wonderful. But at the same time, you have to keep your analytical eye on the ball. You don't want to say things because they're going to make a high impact in the various media and to keep your name in the lights. That's not really what we're about at Investec. About Investec, relatively a new kid on the block, particularly in the UK. It started off as a leasing company in Johannesburg in the mid-1970s. and made its first foray into Britain, I think in 1992, when it bought Allied Trust Bank from Barclays. It's grown from strength to strength over that time. It tries to do things differently, and I think it has to, particularly in the UK, where the competition in the financial space is absolutely intense. So, we try, go that extra mile for the client. The great Investec phrase is breaking China for the client. I think that's a South Africanism. And we try and be distinctive as well. And that makes Investec a very, very different place to work, and hopefully very different and positive for the client. Investec used the concept of the zebra in its marketing a while ago, and I think it's because the zebra is a very fleet-footed and savvy animal. And it's actually, I think there was a marketing guy who spotted a zebra in a field in the UK and thought, wow, that's out of the ordinary. And there came the out of the ordinary slogan for Investec as well. And I think also in a South African context, you've got the zebra with black and white stripes together in a coherent space, and I think that's symbolic as well. Well, Brexit's the term that describes the possible departure of Great Britain from the European Union. As a lot of people know now, the UK will have a referendum on the UK's membership of the EU on the 23rd of June. It's a subject which is engulfing a lot of people, certainly in the office, but when I go and play tennis, when I go down the pub, you can't really avoid the conversation. So it's a really big deal. The UK's been a member of the EU since 1973. We had a referendum in 1975, which of course resulted in a stay decision. But there are lots of nerves, not just in industry, but around in markets about a possible leave vote, which would remove the UK from the European Union. If you're looking at the euro, I think I was one of those people in the early 90s that didn't like the idea of having monetary union without political union, or at least a lot more integration in terms of the institutional and cultural areas of euro members. And I think looking at the euro project, how far are we now? 17 years on. The crisis that we had in the euro area from around 2010, I think, has highlighted the fact that you've got so many divergences in terms of economic performance for one, and also cultural differences for another thing. It's made it very difficult for the eurozone to recover, and it's made it much more vulnerable to crises such as the Greek crisis, which broke out in 2010. So I'm still not a great fan of the structure that there is there. The European Central Bank's done a very good job, as it's one of the few the pan-euro institutions which have got any clout. So it's been under a lot of strain. But I think if the Eurozone is to survive and to prosper properly, there has to be further integration. But that's a very, very difficult sell politically. In terms of the Brexit debate, it's necessary to draw a distinction between the euro, which is, or the Eurozone, which are the 19 European countries which use the single currency, and the European Union, which is the wider set of 28 nations, including the UK. In Britain, there is a widespread feeling that there is too much intervention from Brussels, the centre of European Union power, that Britain loses a certain amount of sovereignty, that there's too much regulation that's imposed from Brussels, and that perhaps Britain would be better off outside the European Union. The debate is very, very wide, and I think that the things that I would be concerned about if the UK left the European Union would be the fact that we have free trade and access to what we call a single market in the European Union, the fact that the UK is a fantastic magnet for inward investment. It's the biggest recipient inside the EU, and that might well cease if we had the uncertainty of leaving the EU. And a third reason, to do with the internal dynamics of the UK, is that if Britain leaves the EU, then Scotland might demand and could well get a second referendum on independence from the UK, which could result in the breakup of the United Kingdom itself. So there are a lot of things to look at in terms of the wider debate. Looking at the internal dynamics on a Brexit, if we take Scotland, for example, Scotland tends to be, as a nation, very pro-European Union, and it's been made fairly clear by the Scottish Government in Edinburgh that if the UK as a whole leaves the EU, then Scotland would demand a referendum on independence from the UK. Now, that would depend on the Scottish vote actually coming down in favour of remaining within the European Union. But if that were the case, it might be difficult to deny Scotland another referendum. Of course, Scotland had a referendum on independence back in September 2014, and the result was no, we don't want independence, but that majority was about 10%. And that might well change in the event that Scotland demanded and obtained a second referendum. In that case, the UK's constitutional position would be that much more difficult. Not only is it leaving the European Union, but around 10% of it in terms of the population and GDP would be looking at leaving the UK. So you've got a multi-dimensional problem there. Again, from a financial market point of view, I don't think that would be particularly helpful. Britain outside the EU would bring a whole host of uncertainties, really. I think number one is that our trading relationship, not just with the rest of Europe, but with the rest of the world, would have a big question mark against it. We wouldn't have access to the European single market, and the terms of our relationship with the rest of Europe would have to be redefined, possibly over a prolonged period. But another factor, and not a lot of people realise this, is that a lot of the UK's trade deals with other countries in the world have been based on deals struck with the EU. And if the UK is outside the European Union, those trade agreements will cease, and Britain would then have to renegotiate 53 trade agreements with different groups of countries around the world. Now, that's a lot to get done in a negotiating frame of 2 years, which is what the European Union Treaty says. Totally unrealistic, and you've got a big uncertainty about our export industries and inward investment as well, and indeed the medium-term path of the economy. What people are actually voting on isn't quite clear. A lot of people are saying, well, British people want more control over migration. In the European Union, there is the free movement of people across all the 28 members' borders. That might be one factor. But a lot of people talk to me about it as an economist and say, well, we don't really feel very well informed about the debate. A lot of the debate, arguably on both sides, is couched in terms of rhetoric. And so I think if you can get away from just looking at the big headline questions on migration and red tape, and actually investigate the real issues, I think that would be a very positive step forward in actually promoting a more rational debate on the subject. In my personal view, I'm not particularly convinced by the economic case for the UK leaving the European Union. I'm very concerned about the UK's external trading relationships. I'm not particularly convinced that not having to comply with European Union rules would really help, largely because a lot of trade is done with the EU, and that would still be subject to EU regulation. It might help certain businesses in the UK with a domestic focus, that they probably do have a large amount of red tape. But I think if you're looking at the net benefit to the economy from Brexit, I'm not convinced of the case, and that's my personal view. Looking at the risks of a Brexit, it's always very difficult to know precisely what financial markets have priced in and what they've disregarded. But what we saw in February, soon after David Cameron struck the deal with the European Council, was that the setting of a date for the referendum, and indeed the London Mayor Boris Johnson's decision to join the Leave camp, caused some shockwaves in financial markets, and we had a sharp fall in sterling in the currency the week after. My suspicion is that markets are partially pricing in the risk of the UK leaving the European Union, but not fully. So if we were to see a leave vote on the 23rd of June, you'd see further downward pressure on sterling. You might see some upward pressure on government borrowing costs, on gilt yields, and also you'd see some reaction in stock markets as well. There are some implications on the rest of Europe from a Brexit vote, if there were a vote in the UK to leave. And that's that we've had some rise in various countries on a populist anti-European Union ticket. I don't know of any European Union government standing on those terms, but certainly in terms of opposition parties, there's a lot of noise being generated in a few countries now. It may well be that Brussels, the centre of the European Union, views that with some disquiet, and that if any of those minority voices came to power in those individual countries, that they may well have to deal with some sort of exit terms. So to make an example of those countries, they might want to set the terms of a potential UK exit to be very, very stringent, which would make life difficult for the UK. In terms of other separatist groups, of course, a great example here is Spain, where we know that we've got a big separatist movement in Catalonia. Now, the Catalans don't want to leave the European Union, but they do want to leave Spain. But it's been made clear by the Spanish government that, for a start, any referendum in Catalonia would be illegal under the Spanish constitution. But if Catalonia were to leave Spain, then they would have to leave the European Union and become an accession country and start the application from scratch. And in that case, giving the UK easy terms, even though the situation was different, wouldn't be something that the Spanish government would necessarily want to do. It's quite possible that other markets outside the UK are affected by a Brexit. Now, you could speculate as to which countries outside the EU would benefit. Perhaps it could be an ex-Commonwealth country. India is an obvious example of a country that has big trading relationship with the UK, which could see increased trade flows. I would say that it's not impossible that what you see is that European markets, i.e. Eurozone markets or other European Union markets, begin to suffer in the event of a Brexit, because the UK is a significant trading partner within the European Union in both directions. And if you're looking at a big trading partner in the EU, you look at somewhere like Ireland. I think something like 30% of Irish goods, goods exports, go to the UK. So I would be a bit concerned if I were an Irish exporter to the UK without a trade deal. Against that, if you're concerned about inward investment to the UK in the event of a Brexit, again, Ireland seems particularly well placed to benefit in that specific area. Over the last 5 years, there's been plenty of talk about European fragmentation, but it's important, once again, to differentiate between the European Union and the Eurozone. If a country leaves the European Union, then that has implications for markets, but nothing like as serious as a country leaving the Eurozone. And in particular, from 2010, particularly to around the middle of 2012 and periodically afterwards, the speculation has that Greece might leave the Eurozone. The great danger during the beginning part of that period was that you get a contagion effect, i.e. Greece leaves the Eurozone because it can't finance itself, and the Eurozone is unwilling or unable to provide a suitable bailout. Therefore, the question is, who's next? You then look at, in retrospect, the other bailout countries, Ireland, Portugal, arguably Spain, because of its banking sector, and then there was speculation over Italy. So, that would have, massive repercussions for the euro area and for financial markets generally, given the shockwaves that would have brought to the global financial markets. We're not in that situation at the moment. In our view, there's a big row coming up over Greece and its third bailout. It's trying to conduct the first review of that third bailout. The IMF, for example, is saying it has to make budget savings of something like 4.5% of GDP, which is just really not a realistic option. And Greece has big debt maturities coming up in July. So it may well be that markets begin to speculate about Greece leaving the Eurozone at some stage. Now, I don't think that will happen, but speculation might be there. Now, the key difference between now and 4 years ago is that any problems in Greece are largely seen as idiosyncratic, i.e. not systemic. And there's a fair chance that, hypothetically, I stress, if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, then you'd see some shockwaves in Eurozone markets, but that would die down. You wouldn't get the who's next question, and then the most important question, which is, well, will the euro as a single currency survive? I think the European Central Bank has dealt with those issues very well, and I think markets are on a reasonably sufficiently firm footing to swipe those questions aside. If you look at economics from, as much as a top-down angle as you can, I look at the global economy, it's in a very tricky place right now. It is likely to carry on growing, perhaps between 3 to 3.5%, but there are more downside risks than there have been previously. You've seen individual issues in various large economies. I think Russia and Brazil being particularly poignant last year, and perhaps this year as well. China's undergoing a very, very difficult transition from mega powerhouse consuming huge amounts of commodities, growing by as much as 15% in 2007, and trying to maintain a growth of 6.5% to 7%, whilst its industrial sectors are slowing down and without causing a big financial bubble. Now, that's a big set of factors to try and achieve, which the Chinese authorities are juggling. Big risks, big policy ask, and of course it has consequences for elsewhere, and the big fall in commodity prices that we've seen. The oil space is an obvious one, but of course other primary commodities as well is throwing up different sorts of problems in various economies, especially those that are dependent on those commodity prices for revenue. If we're looking at negative interest rates, several central banks have tried taking interest rates into negative territory to try and stimulate their economies. Now, it was thought a few years ago that wouldn't be possible, but for example, if you look at areas such as the European Central Bank, Swiss National Bank, Denmark, Sweden, and now Japan, they've all got negative interest rates. The idea is obviously to cut the cost of borrowing, to try and stimulate spending. One of the problems is that there are many consequences of having negative interest rates. One is that it reduces bank profit margins because banks find it very difficult to cut deposit rates, e.g. from zero to personal customers. So that reduces bank margins. It comes at a cost to the banks because they have to pay to park their liquidity at the central banks, and it could actually be counterproductive. So there's a big debate over whether negative interest rates are productive, and if so, what sort of structure you should have sitting alongside the negative interest rates as well. Well, I don't want to necessarily give a view over whether I think Donald Trump would be a good president or not. But if you look at some of the economic policies which Mr. Trump has espoused, such as a big rise in tariffs into goods coming into the US, I would have to say that if those policies were followed through, that could be very, very harmful, not just to the US economy, but a rise in protectionism, as we saw in the 1930s coming from the US, would be very harmful for global trade and therefore the global economy. And we're at a stage now where global trade is slowing down and it's at relatively low levels. So I think if we go back to Donald Trump, much would really depend on, if he became president, look, realistically, what is his economic agenda and his foreign policy agenda? Is he going to stick to some of the policies which he has promoted in his primary campaign, or do we see a shift into something that's more constructive? Let's look at some downside projections to the global economy. Could we see a big collapse in oil prices? It's not impossible. In recent weeks, we've had some support to the oil price, possibly from technical factors, but also from some hopes that nations such as Venezuela, Russia, and OPEC as a whole could restrict supply. It's not impossible that oil prices fall to new lows again. If that happens, in my view, that's pretty dangerous because that would put further downward pressure on inflation rates. Investors would be even less convinced that central banks would meet their inflation targets, and you begin to see some sort of deflationary mindset which could stop spending, or at least slow spending down, and those premonitions become self-fulfilling. So yeah, I do think it's a risk. But central banks are quite aware of those risks. When you begin to see the dangers of that entering into markets, then central banks start making statements, and quite feasibly they back those statements up with policy changes, as we've seen with the European Central Bank. So that's a risk scenario. It's not my central scenario. Oh, in terms of books, quite wide-ranging, but the Game of Thrones series on TV is fantastic. The books are even better. They are absolutely brilliant. And that's a fantastic, great escape through the years of the financial crisis. Being buried in those was brilliant. And I thoroughly recommend those. For something in a slightly different direction, anything written by Ian McEwan. The guy writes so well. Unbelievable, and a number of his novels are must-reads. So those would be my recommendations. If I wasn't an economist, I'd have loved to have been a sportsman or a rock star, but realistically, neither of those things was ever going to happen. I'm fascinated by the IT industry, and the fact that when I came out of university in the 80s, there was big technological revolution, and it's still happening now. And I think, if I couldn't be an economist again and I had to choose a realistic career path, doing something in IT would be fascinating, and perhaps something entrepreneurial. Wow, in terms of inviting 3 people to a dinner party, very, very difficult. I think, one person on the list would be Cicero, the great Roman politician and orator. I've just finished reading Robert Harris's trilogy on Cicero. He had a fascinating life, and his insights on the days of the Roman Republic and the final days were fantastic. And of course, he was a great orator, so he could probably teach me something about public speaking as well. Number 2, I'm a great music lover, great rock music lover. Led Zeppelin, my favourite band. Jimmy Page, I've always hero worshipped for a very, very long time, so he'd have to be on the list. I don't think he could teach me much about playing the guitar, because I'm beyond hope on that one, but I'd have him there at my dinner party. And 3rd, I'd have a comedian, and I'm not sure who. Big fan of John Richardson. Very, very bright comedian with OCD. Big fan of Jo Brand, who just has me in stitches all the time. I just love her humour. So I think I'd have to have four. I'd have both John and Jo there at the same time.